So the focus today was actually on Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson, who was, of the three levels of government, the one that was probably the most directly affected by this protest, given that it was happening in his city. But he took the stand, spoke a lot about insurrection and the horrors of dance parties and raves. And interestingly enough, and I have a clip of it if you're interested in it, the fact that Ottawa never asked for the Emergencies Act. They didn't ask the government on it. They didn't offer any advice. And they weren't even advised on, let alone consulted on, the federal government invoking it in the first place.
Yeah, let's play that clip right now and take a look.
Now, on February 14th, we know that the Emergencies Act was invoked. Were you consulted on the invocation of the Emergencies Act before it was invoked?
No, I wasn't.
Okay. Did the city request that it be invoked?
No.
Did the city weigh in on whether it was required, necessary, or needed?
Well, when it was released, I think, like most people, very few people knew exactly what the Emergencies Act was, to be perfectly honest. I remember growing up in Quebec what the War Measures Act was and the implications that had for the province of Quebec and the rest of the country. But no one had raised the Emergencies Act with us. But when it was invoked and I was briefed on what its powers were, I thought this is a very positive step to getting this situation resolved once and for all because of the provisions in the Act. So I very much supported it, and I was, as you may recall, the current chair of the Police Service Board, Eli El-Shantir, and I sent a letter to the Prime Minister thanking him for invoking the Act because it actually acted as the catalyst for us to move forward and get that whole situation in the downtown core resolved once and for all and give people their street and their homes back.
You know, Andrew, it is not surprising to me that Jim Watson, I mean, he's a Liberal mayor, he's not to my taste, but he's a fairly normal guy. I disagree with some of the things he says, but the idea that he would reach for martial law to handle some noisy but lawful truckers. By the way, by the time they brought in the Emergencies Act, the honking had long since stopped. They, local residents went to court, got a judge to issue injunctions saying no more honking, and it ended. That was long gone by the time the Emergencies Act was in place. I think that's why Jim Watson, like the rest of the country, was stunned when Trudeau invoked it, because there literally was no need for it, was there?
No, and Jim Watson's a bit interesting because he's not popular to a lot of the convoy people. His rhetoric about the Freedom Convoy and a lot of the fake stories and fake narratives that have been purveyed, he himself has talked about. But at the same time, he also did something Justin Trudeau didn't do and the provincial government didn't do, which is allow his office to actually have a conversation with them. And near the end of the protest, there was that deal that was reached between the city of Ottawa and convoy organizers to move trucks onto Wellington Street. So the city of Ottawa and Jim Watson, whatever their shortfalls are in other areas, did something that the federal government wouldn't do, which is actually have a conversation with these people. And that's such a critical point because the whole point of the Emergencies Act is that it is meant to be there when all other means have been exhausted, when existing laws are incapable of achieving the desired outcome. In this case, the federal government wouldn't even engage. They wouldn't even have that discussion, but Ottawa did, and it was bearing fruit just before the Emergencies Act came into play.
And I think that that is no coincidence. One of the things we learned today is that Jim Watson's office, the mayor's office, who was engaging productively, they say, they acknowledge that the truckers were negotiating in good faith, that they were moving trucks around, moving out of the residential areas, keeping lanes free. They were moving trucks when requested. Jim Watson was actually getting his hands dirty and making things happen. And he had the honesty to acknowledge the truckers were working in good faith. I think that was precisely the problem, Andrew. I think that Justin Trudeau wanted an insurrection. He wanted a dramatic moment, like in the US, they had their January 6th insurrection, according to the Democrats. Trudeau wanted that up here. He didn't want peaceful cooperation and a managed protest. He wanted something shocking. And isn't it true that we saw today testimony and documents showing that there was an agreement to manage things, and it was precisely when that agreement started to be implemented that Trudeau pulled the trigger on the martial law. it was almost like Trudeau didn't want this thing to end peacefully, right?
No, because the whole point of the deal was to get the trucks that had been on residential streets onto Wellington Street, where there are no residences. It's just government offices, most of which were empty because of COVID. And that was so key because that would have made it the federal government's problem. And it was interesting that the breakdown in this deal happened after the Emergencies Act was invoked. And more importantly, one thing we learned from the testimony is that it broke down because of police and parliamentary security, not because of protesters.
You know, Andrew, you've really covered this well. I want to give a shout out to your book, The Freedom Convoy, the inside story of 3 weeks that shook the world. Isn't that the truth? #1 Amazon bestseller. We're so proud of you. Thank you for that. Here's my theory on the whole thing. I think you and I are in general agreement about what happened in February. Peaceful protest. Crime actually fell in Ottawa. There was such a demand for crime that they made up hoaxes like they're burning down an apartment. There was an attempted arson. Any crime, any natural crime in the city was attributed falsely to the truckers. They were so desperate to find acts of violence. There wasn't. I was there. I listened to Zexi Lee talk about violence. When she was pressed, did you actually observe any? She said no, other than her friends throwing eggs at the truckers. So I think that the truckers were enormously successful in breaking the narrative that Trudeau wanted. But that's what the media party wants to do with this Trucker Commission of Inquiry. They want to use it as a do-over, as a chance to revise history, because I think they lost that first round. I mean, let me put it this way. That trucker convoy broke the spell of unanimity in this country. We soon saw the federal mandates leaving. Jason Kenney was deposed. Aaron O'Toole was deposed. These truckers did more than anything. I think Trudeau and his bought and paid for media are trying to use this Commission of Inquiry to rewrite history. What do you think?
I would agree. And I think that it's interesting as we go through this process. And remember, it's going to be a couple of weeks before we hear from anyone that was actually involved in the convoy. So the first things people are hearing are about the government's fears of violence, the government's fears of insurrection, this idea that it was an insurrection, this idea that there was organized crime embedded at one intersection they were talking about today. These things are really their attempt to make it seem like things were a lot worse than they are. And everyone can talk about the theoretical risk of violence. No one can point to any actual violence.
You know, one thing that I reminded my viewers about yesterday, and I know you emphasize this, is the whole question that the country has gathered in this commission to answer is not, did anything bad happen? I'm sure there were some bad things. Life is tough. It's not even did any crime happen. I think the answer is generally no, just a lot of parking infractions and horn honking. The question is, was the invocation of martial law justified? And let me put on the screen the very clear test in the law. Is there a danger to Canadian citizens, or is there a risk of violating the sovereignty of this country? And look at that key word, these cannot be resolved by current law. So it not only does it have to be extremely dangerous or an extreme violation of national sovereignty, but whatever the terror is cannot be resolved by existing laws. And that, to me, makes this, or should make this, a slam dunk. There was no reason for martial law. You could have dealt with this with local police force. The OPP testified that they were able to clear the Windsor Ambassador Bridge with Detroit in 2 days without violence, without the Emergencies Act. And all the complaints we're hearing from these Ottawa witnesses about how it hurt their feelings, I don't even know if those are dangers or crimes, but there was nothing that martial law could do for them that regular police couldn't. What you just saw was an excerpt from my nightly show, The Ezra Levant Show. Every weekday I do a monologue. Usually it's about half an hour. Then I interview an interesting guest, and then we read my hate mail or my fan mail, whichever is more fun. It's only available behind a paywall, though. That's how we pay our bills here at Rebel News. We don't take a dime from Justin Trudeau. But the good news is it's only $8 a month, about half the price of Netflix. And in addition to my nightly show, you also get weekly shows from 4 other friends here at Rebel News. So you're getting 36 shows a month just for $8. I think it's worth it. And even if you're not quite sure, do it anyways, because we rely on viewers like you to keep us free and independent. I promise you I'll never take a dime from Trudeau. Just go to rebelnewsplus.com and click subscribe. Thanks.